Good morning, everyone, and greetings in the name of Christ. I'm here today in our Banbridge meeting house as we come to reflect on the words of Matthew 5, verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. It's the second beatitude, and as we reflect on it, so we come to wrestle with what sounds like an oxymoron, that there is a blessing and a comfort to be found in mourning and grief. And as we do so, I recognize that as we reflect on the verse, we all find ourselves standing on holy ground, sacred ground. And it is best that we tread with great caution and with great care, lest we find ourselves insensitively stomping around on one another's broken hearts and walking arrogantly or carelessly through each other's pools of tears. In preparing for today's sermon, as I normally do, I spent a bit of time reading through other people's reflections on the verse, and one pastor wrote of how he had preached on this verse at a major conference. After the session was over and people were mingling and chatting, one delegate came over to him and asked him, "Have you ever suffered? Have you ever lost someone? Have you ever really mourned?" And the pastor paused a moment to think and found himself having to admit that he hadn't. "I thought so," was the response of the person who had come up to speak to him. In this beatitude of Jesus, we are faced with a paradox. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And the great danger of a preacher in trying to find a fresh, clever, interesting, and novel perspective on these words is that one might end up speaking without knowledge and spouting forth something trite and superficial. And so today, I feel indeed that I walk where angels fear to tread, because angels might be more deeply aware than I of the pools of tears that sit beside those who will be listening to this sermon today. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. What could these words mean? What truth is hidden within the paradox? Today, rather than trying to come up with some clever and fresh perspective on what these words might mean, I thought it might be better to reflect on two stories of grief, and hopefully how those stories allow those stories to shed light on the possible meaning of our text today. The first story is one that I think I've told in Drumore before, perhaps in the first few months after having arrived. It is the story of a colleague in the ministry from South Africa. We were serving together in a large church on the east of Johannesburg, and he told me some years earlier his father had passed away. Being a minister, his family had looked to him for direction. And very soon he got into practical mode as he made the arrangements for the funeral, which he ended up conducting himself. He said it was so busy and intense that at the time he never had the opportunity to grieve his father's passing. He was so busy trying to be a minister to his family, trying to provide a container for his own family's grief, that he never really had the opportunity himself just to sit down and cry and to feel personally for himself the sense of pain and loss of his father's passing. Under the circumstances, trying his best to hold things together for his family, he had just put a lid on his grief. In effect, he had forced himself to just suck it up and keep going. He went on to tell how a few years later, on one ordinary Sunday morning, as he mounted the stairs into the pulpit ready to preach and lead a service of worship, as he did every Sunday, just as he was about to start the service, he found himself suddenly overcome and overwhelmed by a flood of tears that he had absolutely no control over. Up there in the pulpit in front of the whole congregation, He found himself weeping and sobbing uncontrollably for no apparent reason. It was with a sense of embarrassment that he had to leave the pulpit and leave the confused and obviously concerned congregation just sitting there, wondering what was happening. He went into the vestry, where for the next 15 to 20 minutes the tears just flowed as he continued to sob and weep uncontrollably. In reflecting on it, he said he hadn't realized how much grief he had been carrying inside since his father's passing. And he hadn't realized how emotionally heavy that grief had been. All he knew was that the grief welled up, and as he sobbed and sobbed and sobbed uncontrollably on that Sunday morning, when he should have been leading the congregation in worship, something of the great weight and burden of that grief that he had been carrying for so long slowly began to lift from that day forward. It wasn't that the grief suddenly now vanished, but that perhaps the beginning of a process of grieving and healing had begun. In our text, the Greek word for mourn comes from the Greek word pentheo, which means to mourn over a death, and it refers to manifested grief, a grief so severe it takes possession of a person and cannot be hid. Is it possible that our verse today could mean something as follows? Blessed are those who cannot hide their grief any longer. They will find relief from the great burden they've been carrying. On that day, that colleague found that he could not hide his grief any longer. He could not keep the lid on it any longer. And from that moment, his journey through grief towards some kind of healing had begun. When I was still in training before I was ordained, I went with a group of other trainee ministers and spent the day at a hospice, where a hospice nurse spoke to us about the grieving process and the work that they do in hospice, working with both those who were dying and their families. And I will always remember her description of grief. She said, grief is like digging through a mountain with a teaspoon. A second story I'd like to share is of a woman that Wendy and I met while we were living and working at a retreat center about an hour north of Johannesburg. Her name was Margie, and she had come to lead a retreat on the spiritual benefits of walking in silence, walking alone, and in the process of walking, finding space to get in touch and to work through the jumble of thoughts and emotions that we often carry with us, but that we are not always aware of. The week made a big impact on me that weekend, but it was not so much the retreat itself that made the impact. Rather, it was Margie herself. There was a transparency about her, a gentleness and a care and a love that was immediately evident. She seemed to possess an ability to open herself to others and to see into a person, to see their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses, and as she spoke with them, to hold them in loving kindness and in a deeply caring presence. Margie also seemed to have an ability to very easily and quickly be moved to tears. And as she was moved by the presence and the vulnerability of others during the course of a conversation, she did not try to hold back as the tears would well up in her eyes. It was clearly an expression of the tenderness and the love that she was experiencing at that moment as she connected with the person in front of her, and as she saw into that person who was standing before her, and as she was drawn in close to them. At one point, she apologized for the tears, or perhaps it was not so much an apology actually, as an explanation. For she was clearly not embarrassed by the tears, as so many of us are. she told a little bit of her own story, how about 30 or perhaps 40 years earlier, her teenage son, aged about 18 years old, had taken his life, and how in that moment her life and her heart had been shattered into 1,000,001 little pieces. Hers had been a long and an arduous journey through grief. But the long-term effect of that grief was that it had made her very sensitive to and tender towards the pain of others. In a word, it had caused a deep and tender love to grow within her towards other people. The death of her teenage son had shattered her heart into 1,000,000 pieces, but in the end it was not a breaking down of her heart. It turned out in the end to be a breaking open of her heart in a soft and gentle and tender love for everyone who crossed her path. Although she still grieved the loss of her son, she said her tears were no longer so much tears of sadness, but rather tears of love. And I wonder if that perhaps is the answer to the paradox of Jesus' teaching, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Why is it a blessing to mourn? Where is the comfort in weeping and grieving? Perhaps the answer is that at the heart of grief is in fact the seed of love. You only grieve those and that which you love. And where there is great love, there will surely also inevitably be great grief. And so grief is an expression of our love. The danger is that if you try to limit your grief, to contain it, to hide it or put a lid on it, the inevitable outcome is that you will also end up containing your love, hiding it, limiting it, putting a lid on it. To cut oneself off from grief is therefore unfortunately also to cut oneself off from love. M. Scott Peck, the American psychiatrist and spiritual writer, suggests that the source of all our psychological suffering is trying to avoid legitimate and unavoidable pain. Is it possible that if we allow ourselves to grieve fully, to really feel the pain of our grief, that over time we might begin to experience our tears of sadness and grief being transformed into tears of tender love? Or perhaps rather, that our tears of sadness, that within them, they've always contained the seeds of love, and that they've simply become the moisture that was needed in order for the seeds of love to grow. The Greek word for comfort is the word parakaleo. Para means from close beside. Kaleo means to call or invite. Putting those together, one has the sense of being called or invited from close beside, close up and personal. And in a way, that is what it felt like being in the presence of Margie. Being in her presence was a feeling of being invited in, invited, called close beside, into her warm, open, and tender presence and loving kindness. Paradoxically, Margie had found comfort and openness and a closeness to others through her grief. Margie was not a professing Christian. Her journey had in the end taken her on a different spiritual path. But her life had become like a transparent window through which the gentle light and love of God could shine. What Jesus is teaching in this verse, I believe, is not Christian doctrine, but rather a universal truth that expresses a universal human experience open to all people. Blessed are those who mourn. They will be comforted. Blessed are those who allow themselves to grieve. They will enable others to come close and in turn become a soft and tender presence where others can feel themselves invited in also. I'd like to end with two quotes. Firstly, from Marcel Proust, a friend of Wendy, sent it to her over WhatsApp on Thursday morning as I was preparing and kind of putting the sermon together. It reads as follows: "We are healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full." And a quote from a contemporary spiritual teacher, Adyashanti: "Grief unresisted becomes grace." Amen. May God bless you as you continue to allow these words to echo and speak more deeply, perhaps into your own suffering and your own grief. Amen.